Who knew that one of the most controversial topics in buying a home is not the price, the area, or mortgage rates, but the HOA?
Hi, this is Ryan and Suzanne McAbee. We're part of a real estate team proudly serving the upstate of South Carolina and Western North Carolina areas, from Greenville, South Carolina, all the way up to Asheville, North Carolina, and everything in between. And we've had buyers relocate from all over the country to our scenic and friendly towns.
One of the most common requests that we get from buyers coming to this area is that they don't want to be in an HOA and that they're looking for unrestricted land. The reality is that unrestricted land may be outside of any established neighborhood areas and may be in rural or remote areas that also may not work. And when asked about why people typically don't like an HOA, it's generally because the homeowner feels like they're going to be told what they can and cannot do with their property.
They've heard horror stories from other people that may not have even been related to them or their situation. And it kind of is like urban legend. It creeps up and kind of takes its own form, right?
Yeah, I think that even folks that are relocating to the area here might be familiar with HOAs back from the states or areas that they came from. And they might find some of the HOAs here in the Western North Carolina and upstate to be a little more accommodating than maybe what they're used to. But it kind of runs the whole gamut depending on the neighborhood.
Yeah, we have very strong relocation patterns from Florida in particular. And Florida has very stringent, usually by the book kind of homeowners associations that have lots of rules, regulations, bylaws, structures. And it can be very overbearing for some people. But up here, you're right. It's a little bit more lax, generally speaking.
Yeah, I think most of the neighborhoods here, I would say, are pretty basic adherences in terms of the HOA. I would say not many of them are going to be restricting things like paint color of your home and things like that. But instead,
there's a gamut. There's a variety that we'll get into in terms of what we've seen here. But the other thing that's kind of important to note, if you're coming from a state like Florida that also typically has very large communities that have a lot of amenities, that typically carries a very high monthly or yearly HOA fee to basically service those common areas. And up here, we don't tend to see those types of neighborhoods. So our HOA fee structure tends to be a lot less than what you may be used to in states like Florida and so on.
Yeah, and I think those are really kind of the ones that have the higher fees are really more in the minority here.
So it's probably good to start with what is an actual HOA. And instead of using acronyms, it's a homeowners association. Sometimes that's called a POA or property owners association, but they're very similar things. And what it really is it covers it sets up kind of a governing board to help maintain common areas and shared living space within a community and kind of set standards about how the look and feel and things that need to be maintained even on your own property. Now, with this is associated usually a monthly, quarterly, or annually fee to help cover and pay for some of those services. And it could really vary depending upon the amenities, but also what is covered. So as an example, if it's more of a condo or townhome community, those fees often cover ground maintenance, lawn care. Whereas if it is a single family home community, that typically isn't going to be one of the things that is offered and covered. But there's variations with everything, of course. We've seen HOA fees range in our area from as low as $25 a year, believe it or not.
Yep.
Now, that's not going to cover very much, obviously, cost-wise, all the way up to, $3,000+ a year. But, what's kind of the difference between, single family home versus condos and townhomes?
So for condos and townhomes, typically the HOA fee is going to be covering most of the exterior maintenance, painting, maybe roof replacement, common areas, landscaping, maintaining picnic areas, things like that. When you're in a single family home area, residential neighborhood that has an HOA, those fees will typically be going to cover maybe like entrance areas. Depending on if you're on a private road, it might be including road maintenance. If your neighborhood has amenities like tennis courts, pools, things like that, then that fee is probably also going to be higher, but it's going to be covering some of those amenities that need to be maintained and repaired.
And really from a cost structure perspective, the two most costly items that you'll probably have that a HOA has to pay for is insurance costs these days for the common areas, for liability and so forth. The road maintenance is a big one if it's private roads. Usually gated communities are almost by default private roads, but it's also very common that other ones that aren't gated also are private roads. So the resurfacing of those roads from time to time is a big expense. And then lastly is that pool is probably the third biggest expense that HOAs face.
Yeah, and I would say I think it kind of goes also with some of those stricter, sometimes the more amenities you have, and sometimes the tighter those rules tend to be in those neighborhoods.
The higher the cost.
And the higher the cost of maintaining and the higher the HOA fee.
Yeah, it's pretty given that if you're in a golf type community, that's going to carry some of the highest HOA fees in our area, which and many of those are also gated communities too. So it kind of goes hand in hand sometimes.
And they're trying to maintain the initial aesthetic and what it was designed to attract those homeowners to that area. They're just trying to keep those standards in place. To maintain those property values.
We know HOAs have kind of monthly annual fees, but there could be some kind of special fees that come along from time to time, right?
Correct. There can be special assessments that are applied to the residents of specific neighborhoods, especially if there are things that kind of like a one-time maintenance fee that needs to be handled, like maybe a culvert repair or
It's kind of a one-time shock. So like
yeah,
it's usually where there's not enough reserves that the HOA has money put aside for this one-time more costly event that happens. So we've seen some special assessments around here for different reasons. And one of those would be
a culvert repair. There's a neighborhood that's in town that the entranceway had some damage to the culvert right at the entrance to the neighborhood.
what's a culvert?
A culvert is a drainage pipe that basically just handles runoff that goes up underneath the road there. So there was some damage there. It needed to be replaced. Essentially, that cost was a one-time fee that was split amongst the homeowners to repair that road. There was another situation where this neighborhood actually had a private community sewer. Instead of each individual home having a septic system, they had a community sewer that handled all the waste from the neighborhood, but that also needed repair. And so, again, there was a special assessment that was split amongst the homeowners to handle those kinds of repairs and maintenance.
And occasionally these assessments can be quite costly. I mean, we could be talking 10,000+ type dollars, just depending. Know in the comments if you found it to be kind of a non-issue or if you've had major problems, and just let us know what your experience has been. You know, as with most things, it's all about the details. So it's really important to read the fine print of the HOA covenants and bylaws. One of the things in terms of the rules that you have to kind of abide by as a community member is in what's called the CCRs for short, but that's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And that kind of spells out everything you need to know. The bylaws are really just how the governing body of the HOA is set up and who can be members and who can be voting members and that sort of thing. So let's talk about some of the common do's and don'ts of an HOA.
I would say the most common rule for HOAs that would be a don't would be to be running a business out of your home. Now, a lot of folks work from home these days. That's a growing trend. That's not really what they're talking about. It's mainly having customers or big trucks coming and going from your house, things that would be a nuisance to your neighbors.
That's the key word. When you read any of these HOA documents, the nuisance word comes up a lot. So, and that's subjected to some extent because what's a nuisance to someone may not be a nuisance to others, but just be aware that, you know.
The other would be kind of our four-legged friends is probably a common one. Now, typically, you're going to be allowed your most domestic dogs and cats. Some neighborhoods might restrict, and some particularly condos, townhomes might restrict the size or type of breed that you're allowed to have in your home. You may only be allowed to have some X amount of pets in your home. Typically, most restrictions for the single-family homes are going to be against horses, pigs,
farm animals.
Farm animals, yeah. Now, some may also prohibit fowl or chickens, but some may allow chickens. It's just kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood thing for chickens for personal use, that is.
Another kind of don't that you'll see a lot of times in there is talking about vehicles and vehicle storage. So personal vehicles, your car, your truck, your van, that's for personal use. Those are generally okay. And usually no limit on how many there can be in your driveway and so forth. Be aware though that a lot of communities don't allow overnight parking on the street. So you need to have enough for in your driveway garage to be able to host all those vehicles. But the other thing that's a common thing in our area, because it's such a outdoor place to go live and play, is recreational vehicles. So your personal vehicles are usually okay. Your car, your truck, your minivan, that sort of thing. And in those cases, it just kind of depends on the community. Some say that you can store those, but it has to be behind the home and not visible from the street. Others say that you have to actually build a structure to enclose those type of vehicles. That can be kind of challenging sometimes too, because they often in the covenant say that it has to be built in a similar style to the home. So if you have like a craftsman home, you have to build a craftsman type shed for your RV, which gets a little bit more costly.
Pretty big one.
Exactly, pretty big one.
There are some solutions though. This area does have a lot of
off-site storage
for RVs, campers, boats, where and it could be covered storage as well.
The other thing that's really a hot topic all the time, and something you should 100% get a survey for so you understand your property boundaries before you do it, is putting up a fence if one's not already there. Now, it's a pretty common rule that either they're going to allow fences or some communities may not allow fences at all. Yeah. The other kind of stipulation, it might be the material and the height that the fence can be at. So definitely read the fine print in terms of those items, because if you're going to put a fence up, you want to make sure it's within your property boundary and that you're also meeting the requirements of the HOA. Otherwise, they may tell you to take it down, and that's a more cost that you don't want to have happen.
That's right. So another common restriction that might be within an HOA rule would be if you were trying to rent out your property for a vacation rental or even sometimes a long-term rental. So it's really important to read those CCRs, those covenants, conditions, and restrictions to make sure you understand what your community will allow. There's also sometimes restrictions where your lease has to be at least 12 months.
which would make it a long-term rental by definition.
Yes. Some neighborhoods will restrict how many properties can actually be rented out at any given time.
It's a rental cap.
A
Is
rental
usually
cap,
what they
yeah.
call.
You might have to be put on a waiting list if there's already that cap for that home that can have that number of rentals.
And usually the caps, I mean, it depends on the size of the neighborhood, but we've seen 10 or 15 maximum rentals in a neighborhood that might be, a plus home community.
Yeah.
That's a really growing trend, actually. We've seen some communities actually amend their covenants to get tighter restrictions, particularly around short-term rentals, because they want to keep the neighborhood as a live-in neighborhood.
And to that point, when we're talking about all these CCRs, these covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a lot of the neighborhoods were put in at different times. So the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Well, Airbnb didn't exist in the 80s, so there might not be any language around that.
So these things evolve, I think, is the point that we're getting to.
Yeah.
They're not set in stone. They will be changed from time to time. And they have to get agreement typically within the entire community. Usually there's a majority agreement that have to pass any kind of change. The other thing, if you're looking for land to build a home, you really have to pay attention for new construction, because if you bought a lot in a community with an HOA, there's often criteria. One of those is kind of minimum square footage. The other might be the architectural style of the home. It may be a very specific. It may have to be built on site or stick built, as it's called a lot of times, and not allow modular or manufactured homes. And where it takes a lot more effort is if the HOA community has some kind of architectural review committee set up. That means that you're going to have to generate your building plans, and maybe even more than that, and get renderings done to what they visually will look like from the street, and submit that to this committee. Then they will review it and approve it or deny it, or come back and say that you need to make these modifications to meet our covenants.
And those covenants can include setbacks, things from the sides, the front, the back from your neighbors. They're just making sure that they're trying to maintain that initial visual appeal of that community. They're trying to protect everybody else's property values as well, just to keep it what it was originally intended for. Another thing to note with new construction is a lot of times some of the HOAs will have rules that, okay, if you're starting construction in January 2025, then we expect to have that done within a year, or sometimes 18 months, whatever that is. Essentially that you can't be building your home for 5 years where your neighbors are going to be having to listen to construction noise for an extended period of time.
That's right. And we've seen some interesting things around architectural review committees, even in our area here. One of them that I found really baffling, but it exists, is that it was kind of a neighborhood that had multiple sections in it. And the section was one of the older original sections. And the bylaw was very specific in the architectural changes that you could make. Number one, you had to keep it vinyl siding. And so if you wanted to kind of improve it beyond what we typically think of vinyl siding, maybe with like a cement board or a hardy board, as it's sometimes called, or do something else architecturally outside, you could not do that. You had to keep it a vinyl siding because of the covenants in this community. Now let's talk about some of the more unique, or let's say weird, rules that we ran across, because we look at CCRs all the time when we're helping buyers relocate to the area. And the first one we're going to talk about relates to rentals.
Yeah, so it's a little peculiar, I think, or maybe counterintuitive to some of the trends that we've seen going on. But one of them is that you can't have a short-term rental in the home while you're living in it.
I'm sure you probably heard the term house hacking, which is you rent a portion of your home out through a short-term rental kind of service like Airbnb. And that would be maybe like a finished basement, or maybe if you had something above the garage with separate access, that sort of thing. And in this community, you can't do that if you're living in it too.
Nope.
So you would lose out on that ability to rent. So again, kind of
a funky rule.
Little spin on things.
Yep.
Another neighborhood, which is probably one of the most restrictive in terms of covenants in our entire area, stipulates that, and this is one that you would really not go for, stipulates when you can put up holiday decorations like lighting, and also when you have to take them down. And it's a pretty short period. It's like 7 days, I think.
I know that would violate some of my decorating timelines, but yeah.
So I know it seems very laughable and kind of trivial, but it matters to people, and it might matter to you. So these are kind of things that you have to pay close attention to.
And everybody's threshold for that tolerance for that is different. It's just something that you need to know before you purchase somewhere and decide to live there.
If you've had any bad experience with HOAs in other states, just realize that in Western North Carolina here, it tends to be a bit more relaxed. And there's certainly lots of options. You can have no HOA to very low fee HOAs, like the $25 one that we mentioned before, that are very low hassle, so to speak. But then you have the opposite of the spectrum, which are very high fee because they have a lot of amenities generally. So it really runs the spectrum here. So when you're ready to relocate, we can certainly help you navigate all of these complicated CCRs and find the right setup that works for you and how you want to live. Remember to hit that subscribe button so you're notified when we release our next episode about relocating to the upstate of South Carolina or Western North Carolina.